Hello, this is Low Gelder, and this is another installment of Let's Talk Consciousness. So, in keeping with the idea that we're exploring the ideas of a consciousness based reality and how you incorporate that in your day to day life if you're taking on the assumption that consciousness is actually the thing that manifests reality and that we partake of it in kind of a way where it is perhaps an illusion of sorts, maybe thought of more appropriately as a dream or a simulation if you want a more technological take on it. But if that is the idea, that we're all fundamentally one and connected, and we are partaking of this with our consciousness or generating it from our consciousness or a larger consciousness, who the fuck knows? Um, how do you bring that into your day-to-day life in a constructive way? So briefly just stating the intent, the topic I wanted to go into with that is the concept of other, and noticing when you are putting people in this kind of category of other and what that implies. And the example that comes to mind, this is actually reaching back several years, but there's a podcast that I like with a comedian, Duncan Trussell. It's called the Duncan Trussell Family Hour. One of his guests, who he's had dozens and dozens of times, is a guy by the name of Raghu Marcus, who is probably the best frame of reference is that he's like a contemporary or a colleague of Ram Dass. And if Ram Dass doesn't ring a bell, this would be a guy by the name of Richard Halpert, who in the 70s basically, through his own experiences, brought a lot of Eastern philosophy to an American audience. The same thing with Alan Watts, bringing it to a Western audience with a kind of Western frame of mind. Anyway, so that in mind, you have a comedian and a guy who are both heavily into Eastern philosophy, and they're having a conversation about how you cope or deal with the idea that we live in a world with people like Dick Cheney, who, they were kind of focusing this conversation around the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, that, you have war profiteers, politicians, and the like, doing heinous shit, justifying wars that, now most of us look back on and we understand what was going on, that it was, a lot of war profiteering and just, it's self-explanatory. It's obviously nonsense. But the question is basically like, if you're angry at conservative politicians, the military, or even the people who support them, um, you know, in this sense, Duncan was kind of going off on them the way I think a lot of us feel comfortable doing. We can look at drastic political differences, and we can feel pretty comfortable, kind of hurling a lot of daggers at those people and feeling okay about it. And Raghu Marcus, who is, this far more studied Buddhist Hindu thinker, who's just looking at it from a very different point of view in terms of his experience, he's saying, look, Duncan, you can be angry about this, but when you look at these people as other, and you're not looking them as, like the beloved, this all-encompassing thing that connects us all, you're in illusion, or I don't remember how they worded it, so I'm just trying to recap the idea, but like you're in separation, you're whatever, caught in the wheel of karma. Like, you can phrase it a lot of ways, but my point is, you're thinking in a way that's not constructive for the quality of your own consciousness. And you could really take a moment to notice those instances and take a different point of view and really transcend. I use this in another video. The phrase third way thinking comes to mind, which basically just meaning that you can be in a paradigm of like positive, negative, righteous and evil, or whatever it is, and almost leap out of that paradigm and jump into this, going from a two-dimensional to a third-dimensional point of view about the situation, and seeing all these other angles of regard and thinking of a different way to handle it. And one of those kind of radically different ways would be regarding these conservative politicians. Again, this is around the topic of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, so that's, you can choose your paradigm. Um, but looking at these conservative politicians that a more left-leaning progressive comedian might really hate, and just to regard them with love, and see them as worthy, and not to hate them, and not to see them as separate from you, but understand that they are, they're expressing their point of view, admittedly in a way that can be very heinous in terms of its consequences. But if this is this kind of drama that unfolds, it needs its villains, and it's multifaceted, you know, consciousness that takes on all these different points of view has a right to learn more about itself in every conceivable way. It can take it in any conceivable direction. So it can do that by being, Eric Prince, the guy who owns Blackwater, and I'm sure his list of moral crimes is considerable. And that's like, he's a spark of the divine as much as I am, or you are, or anybody else who wants to feel superior because they didn't profit from a war or spill untold amounts of blood. Um, it's a horrible thing, and it does generate a lot of disgust and repulsion in us, and anger and all that. But the idea is that you can really benefit from transcending it and looking at things a different way, and stop looking at the people who are on the other side of that issue as other, as separate from you, as unworthy, or being worthy of punishment or intervention. That a lot of people, I think, feel comfortable that saying that certain people shouldn't be allowed to vote, and they're probably being facetious, but it is that kind of thinking where you're looking at a group of people at large and saying somebody ought to do something about that. And it's like, I think that's where you get into all sorts of trouble. But so I'll keep this brief, but I did want to use two examples from television of this kind of thinking, of seeing someone as other and having this kind of contempt and disgust, and then transcending it. And one example is reaching back probably about 10 years or so, a show called 30 Days. It was Morgan Spurlock, the guy who did Super Size Me, and basically took the same premise of doing something for 30 days and seeing what happened. And this particular episode was taking a guy from the Midwest who was like a conservative Christian. Excuse me a second. I didn't want to wait any longer for that. So taking, transplanting this conservative Christian young guy to San Francisco and having him live with like 5 gay roommates, and just seeing what they're all about. And they picked the people very carefully. They didn't make it so that they would like be at each other's throats. But they did an interesting thing, which is, they took this person with Christian values and politically conservative values, just put him face to face with some, liberal gay kids from San Francisco, and see what happens. And what happens is they learn to get along, and the guy actually goes home having changed his mind about his opinion about gay people. Not everybody would undergo that transformation, particularly in just 30 days. But the point is, I think we're all capable of coming to a new point of view about other people. And we can look at people as other and hate them and think that, oh, somebody ought to do something, there ought to be a law, or those people ought to go to hell, or whatever it is. And then transcend that really kind of limiting point of view, that pretty disgusting point of view, in my opinion, but not to judge. So you have that example. Interesting. Another more recent one, Vice TV, because they just, as they had their own channel, it seemed like they just kind of threw a lot of programming out. So I don't even know if this is still a show, but it was basically like three young kids. I mean, they're journalists. I don't mean to disrespect them by referring to them as young kids. They are young, though. They're like in their early 20s. And as if that's something to be to have contempt for. But as I'm turning 33, it's like it's in there. Anyway, they jump into Winnebago, travel around, and like interview people. And one of the groups that they go visit is a group that is like kind of somewhat militia, like it's a bunch of armed dudes who stood up to the federal government over basically like a lands rights issue. The main guy involved, his last name is Bundy. I don't remember his first name. But they had a face-off with the federal government and walked away from it, which is mind-blowing in its own right. But these Vice reporters, excuse me, visited this guy, Mr. Bundy, in person, and one of the things they knew about him was that he had said, some really blatantly racist stuff about black people, and one of these Vice reporters is a young black guy, and so he just asks him very direct questions of like, well, how do you feel about me? And I don't remember literally the conversation that took place, but he's like basically asking him not mean pointed questions, even though he had a lot of really terse feelings, like he was composing himself a certain way, and just ask these really direct questions, and what you hear is like this incredible reconfiguration within this 70 some odd year old man, where he's basically coming face to face with his opinions that are probably things he repeated, that he's heard since he was a child. And it's not to defend it, it's not to excuse it, but if you come at it from that understanding that that guy might be one good interaction away from just growing out of that point of view, I think we all have that capability where we have these blind spots, with thinking someone is other and thinking they're not worthy. So, to conclude that, catch yourself in the moments when you're looking at somebody and thinking something bad ought to happen. I know you don't use those words, but like, there ought to be a law, they ought to go to jail, whatever. Whatever you're thinking, try to take the conflict out of that equation and ask, what, if I do cross paths with somebody with that point of view, what would it take to have a conversation where I maybe engage them in a way where they see me as a human, and we're in these two different opposed groups, and we might actually have a human connection and see each other as worthy, even if we can never come to any understanding at all about that political issue. Like, I think that's worth so much more to engage somebody that way and just open their eyes to the fact that somebody who they disagree with is still a human and still worthy of positive regard. That being said, some people will really fucking test you. So I know it's not all gonna work, but I think to catch yourself doing it, to be better, um, is a real achievement. And I think even if it's just once in a while that you catch yourself and can kind of transcend that dualistic thinking, um, get into a better point of view, I think it's really worthwhile, and it really frees you up to not carry around a lot of judgment and guilt and frustration, because I find myself far less pissed off about the news and just what people say on Facebook or whatever it is, um, because I know they're just figuring something out, and so am I, and we're all on a pretty level playing field in terms of wisdom, even if it seems like people are, um, you know, you want to think they're dumb or whatever it is you're gonna say. The smartest of us still has got a lot of fucking mysteries on their hands, like, the upper limits of what we can figure out on our own from this point of view. I think, not to be discouraging, but I think we should, maybe relax a little bit. So, that being said, enjoy your now.